This week, journalists complain speech is too free in the United States. Now that DOGE has singled out the Department of Education, can teachers' unions make parents turn against Trump? And states like Kansas continue to battle over gender dysphoria and minor children. These stories and much more straight ahead this week on The Lion Week in Review. Welcome into this week's edition of The Lion Week in Review. It's a weekly look at the culture, the courts, your state capitol, and your kids. I'm Chris Stigall. Now, let's meet your panel. Some of the men and women behind the stories at readlion.com. Josh Mann, our managing editor, Michael Ryan, executive editor, and Valerie Cabana is our media contributor here at the Lion panel. Welcome in as we dive into, there's going to be a couple of stories like this today, one related to video a little later in the show, and we kick it off, Valerie, with you, and the notion that schools are not God-free zones. There's been a couple of different stories we're going to tackle in today's show about Texas and the way they're governing themselves. What do you know?
So right now, the 10 Commandments, prayer in schools, this is a big topic nationwide. Last week we talked about Louisiana and how there's some hold up there with the 10 Commandments, and I shared my views on how I don't believe that the 10 Commandments should be in school. But there is a very strong reason behind that. Once we start putting Christianity in schools, which I am a Christian, we start opening the door for other religions to do the same. For instance, the Islam religion also has a document that's similar to the 10 Commandments, and I don't want that in schools. And so I can understand why they don't want the 10 Commandments in schools. As Christians, we have the ability to equip our children to go into school with strong apologetics, where they can defend their faith, where they can share the love of Christ without it having to be something that's forced by the government, which I just believe would open the wrong jar of worms.
You know, Josh kind of moderated that debate between Valerie and Adam last week. Michael, you weren't here for that. I would be curious to know your response to the idea of the 10 Commandments and that being debated in states like Louisiana and Texas.
Yeah, well, Texas in particular is looking at not only putting the 10 Commandments in schools, but also allowing for prayer periods, which is an interesting thought. I don't disagree with anything that Valerie has said. I guess I would lean the other way just from the standpoint that the 10 Commandments is as much a historical document as a religious one, and it's certainly foundational to the United States and its Constitution and its other founding documents. As for prayer periods in public schools, as long as the prayer is voluntary and private, not public, I think that would be okay legally. Certainly public schools have a God problem in that it's really hard to properly teach about the creation as in science class without teaching a little bit or mentioning or acknowledging the Creator. And so I find that problematic with public schools. And if your school can't broach the topic of the Creator, then you might want to look around.
You know, Josh, it isn't that I disagree with a word Michael said. I would ask you, though, is that why you would make an argument for homeschooling or Christian education, if that's important to you?
Yeah, I think if, as a parent, you know, you should take responsibility for your child's education wherever you're going to send them. And if you want to instill in them a biblical worldview, you've got to consider what your public school is going to teach them and what your other options are. And so to the extent that you want to inform them, I mean, maybe you teach them when they get home from school if you decide on a public school, but maybe you instead want to homeschool them or send them to a Christian school who will teach them the worldview that you want. And the thing I would say in general is I love the sentiment from one lawmaker in Texas who says schools are not God-free zones. I think that I completely agree with. We need the First Amendment to prevail in schools. Now, the question of whether to mandate a school to post something on their wall, that's a different issue, and I think one that we probably disagree a little bit more with among, you know, people of religious faith.
The Lion is covering all kinds of things, not just in public schools, culturally too, and politically, of course. JD Vance last week was in Munich and spoke to the global community, a lot of the leaders, specifically in Europe. Michael, he called out, addressed free speech issues, addressed natural rights and the First Amendment in the United States and how it's certainly been under attack. We've discussed that on the show in the past. I found the reaction from a lot of people in the United States, particularly on the Democrat side, apologizing to Europeans, when, in my view, what J.D. Vance was celebrating and pushing was the notion that the natural right, our First Amendment, is something that everyone should enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people think it should be exported, not just kept to our own continent. The sound you hear, I mean, if you look at X, if you're watching X and you have the right feed, you know what JD Vance is talking about, because there have been so many just eye-popping, alarming, crazy actions by European authorities against speech. So, I would say that the sound that you're hearing from Europe is Orwell spinning in his grave so fast that he could bore through to China. J.D. Vance's speech, I think, will be looked at by history as a second Iron Curtain speech. And, he was just making the point that, if you can't pray over abortion half a football field away from an abortion clinic, silently in your head, you got a problem with speech. And that really is the thought police. Can it happen here? I mean, you just look at what CBS has done in the last few days. They kind of touted some of the European crackdown on speech. And one person on CBS suggested that the Holocaust was caused by free speech.
Yeah, we'll get into that a little later in the show. Josh, you lived in the UK for a time. Outlawing speech, hate speech, hurt feelings. CBS, I think, this weekend had a 60 Minutes interview with maybe a German official who said hurt feelings could be cause for breaking the law.
Yeah, it's really chilling. Any crackdown on free speech like this is chilling. And it's, they're trying to say that they don't want people to obstruct the access of, say, women who are trying to access abortions. And I think we all can kind of understand what kind of obstruction might need to be prevented. But for somebody to pray, to silently pray, to even tell someone that they disagree with them, this isn't something that we can restrict. If we do, it's a slippery slope, and we don't want to find out what's at the end of that. I think we have seen what's at the end of that. We can look around at communist regimes over the last 150 years and see what happens when you see this authoritarian censorship. It's just not a place we want to go. And so we have to do everything we can to protect free speech.
Valerie, any speech you could think of, as someone who's in media and social media, any speech that you could think of that ought to be illegal?
No, but you should also be respectful. I have experienced people being so hateful on social media, like death threats, that, it should just be common morals that people understand you shouldn't say things like this. But when it comes to expressing your own personal opinions that are not harmful to someone else, I don't understand the hype behind this cancel culture, because it's very evidently just wrong. I mean, one person described walking by someone praying silently as horrible and emotionally draining. Why would someone think that? They are in their own element, not even affecting you at all. Why do you feel that way? It's because you're convicted, because you're in the act of doing something so horrible, where if you would talk to that person, they would be able to speak life into you and really probably help you through what might be one of the biggest decisions of your life.
Transing our kids. This is something that in Europe we've covered quite a bit. They've actually pulled back on this in Europe. They've realized that the decades-long experiment of trying to transition minor children is a reckless thing to do. Here in the United States, though, we're just starting to fire it up, Michael.
Yeah, there's a public library in the Kansas City area that on February 28th is hosting a National Reading Day Trans Stories event for kids of all ages. And, it's not going without notice among conservatives in the community. Now, Johnson County, where it's taking place, is traditionally, it has been a rather conservative area. It's the largest, most populous county in Kansas, which is considered a red state, although Johnson County voted for Kamala Harris in 2024. So the demographics of the county are changing, and apparently so are some of the actions that are going on. When parents contact me and get upset about things like this event, I tell them that, people need to know what's going on. They're not getting it through the traditional media, only through places like The Lion. They're not hearing about these things, number one. Number two, they're getting these events because nobody who cares is showing up to meetings or maybe even showing up to vote. The Johnson County Commission doesn't get the kind of attention it deserves when the election time comes around, because they not only do what county commissioners do, but they appoint boards such as library board, which at this point is 6-1 liberal to conservative.
Valerie, on a somewhat related note, the Department of Education, new sheriff in town, Linda McMahon, she testified last week. If she's confirmed or when she's confirmed, she's basically there to shut it down. One of the things that they're doing is tackling this issue head on. That is boys, males, competing against women.
Absolutely. So the Department of Education is urging athletic associations like the NCAA to give back awards to the women who earned them that might have been taken from them because they were competing against a biological male. So the awards would be taken from the men, given to the women. And if you ask me if I'm for it, absolutely, because I am pro-woman when the left obviously can't define what a woman is. And as a former athlete, I think this is absolutely despicable that we even got to this place to where a man got an award over a woman. I don't care what you identify with. If you have XY chromosomes, you are going to be stronger than a woman. And as someone who is pro-woman, it has to end. It has to stop. And I'm so excited about the direction that we are going, but we're not there yet. We need to keep pushing and fighting for it. If this would have been me, if an award had been taken from me, I would have been in somebody's face. You wouldn't have been able to stop me.
Great editorial also at The Lion. Josh, on homeschooling, I know you're a homeschool dad. You say that all the hysterics surrounding it are actually causing an uptick in it.
Yeah, that's right. This was written by one of our great staff writers, Sean C., who is also a homeschool mom. She's writing about an Iowa bill that would basically give families more protection, more privacy. Homeschool families require less paperwork from them and after they decide to homeschool. And what she's reacting to is an op-ed from a former union person from Iowa who's saying, look, we've got to require these homeschool families to do this paperwork. We've got to make sure their kids are vaccinated. We have to know if they're vaccinated or not. We have to make sure they're teaching certain things. And we can't let them teach more than 4 unrelated children in their house. That's actually currently a law in the books. So this current bill being considered in Iowa would actually free up homeschool families, would even free, let's say, retired public school teachers to teach a class of, say, 5 or 10 unrelated children in a kind of tutoring program. These kind of hybrid schools that are so popular. And so basically our writer debunks some of those myths that are being repeated about why this law why this bill shouldn't become a law. And so it's really a privacy, pro-family rights, parents' rights kind of piece, and I hope that our readers will take a look.
Great stuff, panel. Thank you. When we return, we wade through some of the sights and sounds from the week on cable news and on Capitol Hill. That's as The Lion Week in Review rolls on next. Welcome back to The Lion Week in Review. If you missed any of today's show or you're interested to learn more, you can always check out all the great information you've heard here today, both at readlion.com and on YouTube. So, panel, let's jump into some of the sights and sounds of the week. We start with the American Federation of Teachers. Union boss, Randi Weingarten's her name. We're very familiar with her work here. She says an audit of the Department of Education by Elon Musk and DOGE is just cruel. Take a listen.
You can make departments more efficient, and I'm not a big believer in bureaucracy, but this feels like, as Elon Musk said to you, evisceration. So here's a guy who has hundreds of millions of dollars of contracts from these departments, and he's not touching them, but what he's doing is really taking money from kids who really need it in the field. And these departments, yes, they can be much more efficient, but that's what the education department does. It gives out money to kids so you can feed them a decent lunch, so we can have, tutors for reading, so you can actually help kids with math problems.
So, panel, cruel. It's cruel, and the Department of Education deserves to be left alone, Josh.
Well, it might be cruel if that was true, but the Department of Education is enormous, and the free and reduced lunch program is one part of what is a huge federal agency. And my understanding is the presidential administration has said there are a number of programs that federal agencies do that will remain, maybe in a different form. And so the real question is, do we need a federal agency overseeing education? Most education people I know, like people in public education, prefer local control, and they're not that big on the federal government's help anyway. And so I actually heard Randi Weingarten say that really the Department of Education doesn't matter. And so here she's just coming out on the media to predictably defend an agency that elsewhere she said, well, it really doesn't matter. We don't really have to have it.
It's kind of interesting, Michael. I don't hear a lot from her, and even in that clip, she was more sedate than she typically is. I get the impression that teachers' unions feel like they might be on the losing end of this debate.
Yeah, you get the impression that she doesn't believe too much in her argument. Number one, Elon Musk, this is not about Elon Musk. They keep trying to personalize this and say it's all about Elon Musk. No, it's about the federal government. And one of the things that they're finding, by the way, in their auditing process is that the number of Social Security numbers is outpacing the population in America. There's a problem there. And we're not taking money out of kids' mouths. The school lunch program is an ag department program, and we're not taking money away from kids for other programs. If anything that needs to be done can be done at the state and local level, and if there's federal money available, it can be done without the Department of Education. We're talking about basically an argument between people who are just touting feelings versus facts and figures.
And Valerie, I'll ask you to think on that for a minute while I play this clip, because it also has something to do with Elon, to Michael's point. DOGE, Paul Begala on CNN, still angry. They're all angry, supposedly. And Elon Musk, who continues to crusade waste, fraud, and abuse is an issue of his wherever it may be found in any department. Take a listen.
Who the hell voted for Mr. Musk? Who the hell voted for, excuse the phrase, a guy who calls himself Big Balls, a 19-year-old kid, going in there and trying to fire cancer researchers and scientists and teachers and agricultural specialists? It's appalling. And I say again, it is Mr. Trump's voters who are far more dependent on government than the Democratic voters. The 10 states who rely most, for example, on education funding for their schools, federal funding, all 10 voted for Mr. Trump.
It's interesting because I've heard this before, and I'm not entirely sure, Valerie, that he's making the point he intends to. Something like, if I heard this right, 70% of the wealthiest voters out there voted for the Democrat, for Kamala Harris. And the least wealthy, well, anyway, the point is, I don't know the numbers, but the majority of the wealth is found on the left. Paul Begala kind of making that point there, that somehow those who might not have as much are dependent on the government. And he finds that ironic that Trump voters would be cheering on Elon Musk. So your reaction?
Yeah, they're so mad. It is comical. I mean, have you seen the things that DOGE has uncovered? Are you guys choosing to turn a blind eye because it's just something that you don't agree with? He asked who voted for Elon. No one voted for Elon. Well, Elon and Donald Trump had been working in unison with one another for Donald Trump's campaign. They were on the same team. So who voted for him? Mr. Trump, as you say. No, President Trump's supporters were voting for Elon when they voted for Donald Trump, and he is doing a really great job.
It's an interesting thing. Paul Begala seems to be saying, Josh, that the more rural or impoverished communities were actually Trump supportive and thus shouldn't cheer on Elon Musk's work?
Yeah, there's this, part of the argument is, you demonize the wealthy, and it's kind of easy to throw a rich guy under the bus. He's rich, and he just wants more money. But I don't think it's about the money for Elon, not his personal wealth. But back to your point about these rural people who voted for Trump, I think what people voted for was stop wasting our money. We want a government that represents us and represents our interests. And so I can't fault any American who wants to see their government be more efficient. And so, and I think you've got a lot of support out there for these cuts and this desire to be more efficient. It just seems like Musk becomes a kind of scapegoat for the left.
Had to pick my jaw up off the floor for this one, Michael. You referenced it earlier in the show. Margaret Brennan faced the nation talking this past Sunday to Marco Rubio about the JD Vance speech in Munich when she said this. Listen.
He was standing in a country where free speech was weaponized to conduct a genocide. And he met with the head of a political party that has far-right views and some historic ties to extreme groups. The context of that was changing the tone of it. And you know that the censorship was specifically about the right.
No, I have to disagree with you. Free speech was not used to conduct a genocide. The genocide was conducted by an authoritarian Nazi regime that happened to also be genocidal because they hated Jews and they hated minorities and they hated those that they had a list of people they hated, but primarily the Jews. There was no free speech in Nazi Germany.
And, Rubio went on to knock it out of the park, Michael, but that's a journalist. That's an American journalist that blamed free speech for the Holocaust.
Yeah, it's frightening. It really is frightening that somebody with so much capacity for free speech, a network anchor, can be so against free speech, at least for the other people. And what an ignorance of history to begin with. I mean, it's just ridiculous to say that free speech caused the Holocaust. There was no free speech in Nazi Germany. The people in charge had speech, but not the people. It's just ridiculous. But to think that the American media have such a dim view of free speech today, it's frightening.
And Josh, I'll pivot to this next story. There's a Texas school district, and we referenced this a little earlier, making some moves to alter some books and keep some materials from the school kids that are either sexually charged or content in the textbooks they deem inappropriate, maybe overly political. One news channel, and I think the Houston area, framed it this way, and then I wanted to get your reaction, Josh.
Book banning, in one form or another, goes back a long time. And now it's fashionable again, at least in some of our school districts. Cy-Fair ISD is doing it a little differently, stripping out individual chapters in textbooks. They made that bold move last year without much warning, and this year those chapters are gone. Vaccines, climate change, and diversity are among the offensive ideas.
Now, Josh, I could get into the specifics, and we don't have the time to, but isn't it interesting? I put those back to back. Margaret Brennan making the case free speech led to the Holocaust. Down in Texas, they're trying to control some of the materials the students are getting, and they're likening them to Nazis. So the theme seems to be, no matter where you come down, if you oppose the left, you're a Nazi.
Yeah, that was very startling to see that juxtaposition. I mean, there's a huge difference. For example, none of what the left are calling book bans are true book bans. These books are not prohibited. These kids can still access this material and far more explicit material if their parents want them to. This is really about parents' rights and what we want schools to be requiring all children to read and have access to. A huge difference.
And just briefly, I'll kind of volley this story to anybody who wants it. The state of Kansas has passed legislation to forbid the medical transing of minor children, but that hasn't stopped many from testifying against the effort, including this case made here by a biological female who's transitioned at age 16. Take a listen.
My name is Anthony. I am a Kansan. I'm a KU honors student, and I'm a transgender man. I came out and received medical transition here at the age of 16. This type of decision was something that should have stayed between me, myself, and my healthcare providers. But even at the time, in 2020, I knew that there was the potential for that care to be legislated out. When I think about the medical care I received, I realized that medical care was life-saving. And when my parents tell me how they feel seeing me before and seeing me after, they tell me that I seem... Looking back now at my decision transition and my time in school, I recognize how life-saving the medical care and recognition I received was. My transition was supported by my teachers and administrators while in school. They allowed me the dignity of being treated and referred to as any other young man in their building. This opportunity was immeasurably important to me. As with including extracurriculars, I spent around 50 hours a week there. I cannot imagine having the place where I spent the majority of my time feel hostile to me.
Valerie, I'm actually going to assign this one to you if you don't mind, only because I know someday, as you look down the road of motherhood, your minor child says they want to do something this radical to themselves. This individual would have you believe, hey, I did it, my parents let me do it, and I'm better off for it. You say?
I find it absolutely heartbreaking that this person had such an identity crisis that her only response was to transition to a man. I find it absolutely heartbreaking that her parents said, oh, you want to do this and that's life-saving? Then let's go down that road, rather than seeking mental help, because that is an identity crisis. And as a Christian, it is so important to just be able to find our identity in Christ and who he says that we are, who he created us to be, because God doesn't make mistakes. And even in a situation to where you are struggling with that, it does take time to get through it. And when we see these people who are detransitioning that are so thankful that they didn't have gender affirming care before they were 18, or even ones that did, they say they're so glad it didn't happen and they wish it would have never happened.
It's bonkers. I have a 16-year-old daughter who I don't let drive in the dark. Never mind try to become a male surgically. But anyway, guys, thank you. Coming up next on the Lion Week in Review, our panel picks the story of the week that you don't want to miss. Stay tuned. Hey, welcome back to the Lion Week in Review. I'm Chris Stigall, back with our panel. As we wrap up, we always like to ask their favorite stories of the week. Which particular story at readlion.com do they call your attention to? Valerie, we start with you today.
Yeah, so it's going to be a story we published earlier this week. Florida abortions declined after the heartbeat law went into effect. So in the first full year of Florida's 6-week abortion limit, the number of abortions fell 28%. Now, 28% doesn't seem like that many, but when you do the math, that is 23,297 fewer abortions, and that is huge. This study found that more women are taking precautions to prevent unwanted pregnancies, and so we've got a win across the board.
Josh Mann.
I want to call our readers' attention to this line from my colleague Michael. When he reached out for comment to a particular place, you wrote, but officials there typically disavow any responsibility in such matters. And I thought that was a really important way of saying they declined to comment, because what we're seeing is a lot of times these libraries and schools and different organizations that do things that a lot of parents object to, when you ask them why they do it, they just don't have a response. They don't have a justification. But what we're seeing right now, as we see this kind of tide turn against some of what critics call woke, you're seeing leaders start to take responsibility, and you're starting to see people shift.
Michael, your favorite this week.
Well, I don't know if it's my favorite, but I want to talk about that story because it's so important for parents to understand, as Josh was talking about, that libraries and such don't really take responsibility for the content of the books or the events that they host. So parents need to be aware of what's going on, and what's going on is that because libraries aren't kind of policing these things, trans advocates in the publishing industry are taking full advantage of that, and parents need to know.
That'll do it for this week's edition of The Lion Week in Review. Be sure to keep up with all the latest news every single day at readlion.com. And again, if you missed any of today's show, you can always check it out on YouTube. For all of us here at The Lion, thanks for downloading the show, and we'll see you next week.